Just a bit, so just a bit of background about myself. I'm actually from the US, originally from North Carolina, so not too far from Atlanta. And I did an exchange here during undergrad. So I went to the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. I spent a semester here in Singapore as an economics major. And yeah, like I said, I've been here about 8 years at the university. So hopefully I'll be able to give some practical knowledge kind of from that US lens, and then kind of what to expect in your time in Singapore. So I'll just dive right in. So yeah, this is a talk about the student exchange program here at NUS. Let's see. Okay, yeah, full screen. Yeah, so in terms of Singapore, we have the reputation or the kind of nickname of being the little red dot of Southeast Asia. So it's a very, very small island. I think it's from East Coast to West Coast, you can drive it in about 1 hour, maybe an hour and 20 minutes in traffic. So a very, very small dot here in the middle of Southeast Asia. We're 1 degree above the equator, so it is hot and humid all year long. So average temperatures are around 30 degrees Celsius, 88 degrees Fahrenheit. And yet with it being an island, very humid. One kind of tip I do tell students though, someone told me before I traveled to Singapore, is to pack a hoodie. So bring your Georgia Tech gear when you're here, just because indoors can be very heavily air conditioned. So if you watch a movie or take an exam here, it can be what I think quite cold. So I think you'll surprisingly use your Georgia Tech swag a little bit more often than you would anticipate, kind of seeing these temperatures here on the slide. So yeah, very small island. I think for a US perspective, we're about 3 times the size of Washington, DC, and that would just be the district. So we're 3 times the size of that. In terms of why Singapore, I think students have a wide variety of different reasons for wanting to come to Singapore. I, again, as an economics major, was just really fascinated with the Singapore story and just kind of seeing all that the country had done in such a little amount of time. So Singapore was founded in 1965. So a relatively young nation, very important in terms of global trade. So I was just kind of very inspired by that story. It's also English speaking. So there's 4 official languages here, Mandarin, Chinese, Tamil, Malay, and English. So you'll hear the announcements in 4 different languages on the buses and trains. But English is the working language for both business and education. So it's very, very accessible. You're able to get by only speaking English, which is quite reassuring, I guess. If you only speak 1 language, then Singapore is definitely a great location if you're an English speaker. It is one of the safest locations in the world. So I think Singapore and Japan are usually kind of tying for the top spots for the safest countries. So I think that can be really reassuring, especially in a time like this, which I'll talk about COVID later. But I think students and parents are very assured in terms of the safety record here in Singapore. So that can be kind of a sense of relief as you kind of consider different locations. Seamless and efficient public transportation system. So I know just coming from the US, where public transportation is not super widely available, it still kind of blows my mind that you can get on buses and trains and kind of get anywhere on the island really seamlessly. You use a tap card, so you kind of tap in and tap out. It's pay by distance, so you can go from campus to the airport for about 2 Singapore dollars or about $1.50 in the US. So very affordable, easy to get around. So I still love that even 8 years in. A few things that I also just enjoy about Singapore. I think when people hear about an island in Southeast Asia with nearly 6 million people, super small in terms of its kind of footprint, people kind of expect it to be metal and glass and kind of Manhattan-esque. But I think Singapore has done an incredible job of kind of infusing green spaces into our kind of everyday life. And so if I draw your attention to the left-hand side, that middle photo is actually our School of Design and Environment. So just campus is very green. These kind of large trees are taken into account when any new building is built or any kind of modification. So we've kind of built our city kind of around these incredible trees. And I did hear at one point that only Rio and Singapore are the only cities with certified rainforest within a city limit. So it is an incredibly green place, which I think people do appreciate when they're here. So you kind of get the best of both worlds in terms of thinking you're in a highly densely populated island, but you have these green spaces to kind of get some breathing room. Another thing that's amazing about Singapore would be the food. So it is a very cosmopolitan place in terms of its kind of population makeup with different cultures coming together. And that translates nicely to very exciting kind of food items around the island. So I've always heard that Singapore is a country that lives to eat rather than eats to live. So people get very, very excited about the food here. They have these kind of outdoor food courts, which are called hawker centers. So this kind of main shot here would be kind of a quintessential hawker dish where you can go with friends and order many different dishes and kind of try and sample different things. So I think people will definitely appreciate the food here in Singapore. It's one of my top reasons for staying here so long. So that's just kind of a brief introduction about Singapore and some of the things that I quite enjoy about the island. But in terms of kind of introducing the university properly, so NUS is the largest university here in Singapore. It was founded in 1905 as a medical school, and it's grown into a comprehensive university with 17 different schools and faculties. In terms of location, so we are located in kind of the center west part of the island. We're about 35 minutes from the city if you're taking buses or trains, and then about 30 minutes from the airport if you take a taxi. If you're taking the train, it may be about an hour and 10 minutes maybe. So still accessible. We're right on the metro line. But one thing that I do appreciate about NUS is you do get the best of both worlds in terms of having a dedicated campus feel. So you're not right downtown, so you're not kind of overwhelmed by all the hustle and bustle that's happening there. But then you're also really nearby if you want to go there in the evenings or on the weekend. So I think you kind of get the best of both worlds with that kind of dedicated campus feel that's kind of separate from the main city, but then you're able to access the city if you need to. So we do have actually 3 different campuses. Not a lot of students would kind of know that we have 3 campuses around the island. But for the purposes of the Georgia Tech arrangement, you would all be at the Kent Ridge campus, which is our main campus. So that would be the one featured here on the right. Bukit is actually the original campus, so that's where the medical school started. Now it houses our law and public policy, but those 2 schools are not applicable to our exchange. And then Outram is our Duke NUS Medical School, which isn't applicable to any of our exchanges, so that's not featured here. And one fun fact, all campuses are located by MRT stations. So if you did need to go to campus, if there was ever like a speaker or some kind of series that you wanted to attend at one of the campuses, you could access those easily with the MRT system or the subway. And then we also have a free shuttle that connects Kent Ridge and Bukit if you needed to kind of go to those different campuses. But for the purposes of your housing and classes, that would all be at Kent Ridge based on the arrangement with Georgia Tech. In terms of school facilities, so this is just kind of a snapshot of campus. It is a very large campus. We had those internal shuttles just because with the sheer size of the campus, as well as it's built on a ridge, so it can be quite hilly. So if you combine all of those things with the heat and humidity, students will take the internal shuttle buses quite a bit. But some of the kind of favorite things that students have mentioned in the past, we do have an infinity pool at University Town. There's the largest Starbucks in Singapore that's located at U-Town as well. Bubble tea, people are crazy about bubble tea right now, so they have a few outlets across campus. There's a town green at University Town where you can see people playing like frisbee and things like that, soccer. And I think you'll see with the heat that those places get a little bit more they get busier around like the morning and the evening just to kind of avoid the hottest part of the day. So this is just kind of a sense of campus and the things around. And then some of the more practical things, we do have libraries and museums scattered throughout campus. We have a new sports center, convenience stores. So we have grocery stores and kind of 7-Eleven or Cheers stores that are located. So you really could live on campus and not have to venture out into the city or any of the neighborhoods. It's really a self-sufficient place. We have 2 banks. We have a university health center. So part of your exchange fees, they're kind of your miscellaneous student fees that would cover your insurance, which gives you access to UHC. And to access the doctors there, you just pay a very small copay. Usually it's around 10 Singapore dollars or about 750 US. And then again, the internal bus shuttle, which you'll all become very familiar with once you're here, hopefully. In terms of getting involved on campus, I think that students understandably kind of come to Southeast Asia and kind of recognizing that Singapore is an aviation hub. They kind of have this outward perspective and they're constantly using their weekends and evenings to travel as much as they can. I would say use some of the clubs and societies, especially in a time like this with COVID and with international travel being kind of severely limited. It is good to kind of get involved on campus and use these different clubs and societies to help you kind of meet locals or get to know something about Singapore that you wouldn't otherwise be able to do. So we have NUS Sync, which is a website that kind of shows you ways to get involved in what's all on offer. And yet these could range from arts and culture clubs to sports, community service things, and interest groups. So a wide variety of things to get involved with while you're here. So I think these are kind of a great balancing act to the kind of all the international travel that could be available just from the region. In terms of events and activities specifically for exchange students, we do have a group of who we call the PALs, the Peer Advising Leaders, and that's a group of anywhere from 6 to 10 recent returnees, so NUS students who have gone on various overseas programs. They come back and then they want to get involved and give back, and so they work very closely with us to put on a wide variety of different activities for exchange students. So this is kind of the standard lineup, but this could very well change just kind of from year to year. But there's always a welcome party, no matter if you're joining us in the fall or the spring. We'll have a welcome party for exchange students, a coffee catch up around the school tours. The Global Lounge meetup is the one that changes the most because that's usually like kind of seasonal. So if you're here in the spring, we'll do things for Chinese New Year. And then if you're here in the fall, it would be like National Day or Singapore's kind of Independence Day. And then there's festivals like Deepavali that the PALs would do events for at the Global Lounge. And then lastly, the Dragon Boat event is kind of the fan favorite. So that is an event where we bring 120 students out to Kallang, and it's a river that kind of goes right by the skyline. So that is always a very, very popular event with exchange students. So just diving into more of the kind of academic side of the university. So again, we are a comprehensive university in the center of Asia. All modules except for foreign language modules are taught in English. So I think those two things are quite incredible in terms of an opportunity. So you're able to take modules from a wide variety of subjects, all in English, and from that very like uniquely Asian or even more specifically like Southeast Asian perspective. So you can take your standard kind of economics course, but you can also take it from like a lens of the Southeast Asian economy or just kind of like economics with that kind of Asian focus. So I found that really incredible. And with the English taught modules, there was no language barrier or anything like that. We do have 2,000 exchange students every academic year. So rest assured you will not be alone while you're here. We partner with about 50 universities in the US alone. And Georgia Tech is actually one of our largest exchange partners in terms of per institution. So you'll have a lot of fellow Georgia Tech students with you as well. And then tuition fee waiver, I put this in there just to kind of go over what that means. So you will continue to pay your Georgia Tech tuition, but there will be things like the miscellaneous student fees that will be payable just because they're kind of non-academic and they really do serve the purpose of those kind of student services, be it health services or just general facilities. So that will be payable by students. I think it's about 120, or I think it's about 100 US at the moment for those miscellaneous student fees. So it's not a huge expense, but it is something that's payable. And so it's at least something to clarify in terms of what's covered under that tuition fee waiver. So I spoke a little bit about before we got into the presentation formally, but we have what we refer to as a university-wide arrangement with Georgia Tech, and that basically means that these 5 faculties or schools at the very top, those are what would be applicable to our exchange. So that would be our arts and social sciences, engineering, science, computing, and School of Design and Environment. So those 5, as long as you meet the prereqs for the courses, and if there's a vacancy in the module, then you would be eligible to take those courses. Those in red are kind of orange. Those are more for school-specific exchanges. So that would be things like 2 different business schools have an agreement with between each other, and only business students travel to and fro. So we don't have that with Georgia Tech at the moment. So it would all be those university-wide. So the top 5 in blue would be what's applicable for our specific arrangement. And it sounds like the majors that were shared earlier, that would be those would be applicable to what we have going on between our institutions. In terms of modules, so students do take between 3 to 5 classes or courses over a semester. 3 is the minimum, and that is the minimum required to be considered full-time and therefore eligible for a student visa. So you have to secure at least 3 to be accepted into the program. 5 is the maximum you're allowed to take. But I would say most students do take around 4 just because 5 can be a bit intense, especially as you are already coping with a new country and a new university and wanting to kind of travel and get involved on campus. So you're already balancing quite a lot. So I think 5 modules would be quite a hefty course load. But always check with your academic advisors as well with Georgia Tech, because you want to make sure that you are taking the number of courses that they need you to take for you to graduate on time. So just anywhere between 3 and 5. And then of course, check with Georgia Tech in terms of making sure you're taking what you need to while you're here. In terms of how the classes work, so it's I think more of a UK style where it's a lecture tutorial system where there's often one lecture a week, and it can be around 2 hours or 3 hours, depending on the class. And then there's a tutorial that's either weekly or bi-weekly, depending on the specific class. So I think that can be a bit something to get used to, just because coming from the US, it's often those Monday, Wednesday, Friday classes or Tuesday, Thursday. So you're kind of meeting more often, but for a shorter duration. Whereas here, it's kind of like you're there for 2 or 3 hours once a week. So I think you will find that you have more free time compared to the US in terms of actual in-person instruction. But the expectation is that you're doing a lot of self-study and kind of keeping up with the material on your own. So I think balancing that, what seems like free time is actually time that you're supposed to be kind of making sure that you're doing all of the work prior to that really long lecture every week. In terms of how to prepare, so I put these useful links. The first one would be the list of modules open to exchange students. So that is updated twice a year as the application cycles start. You can refer to that list and it will show you which modules are open to exchange students. The next one would be the list of restricted modules. So just kind of making sure that you're not taking or not selecting things that are restricted when you fill out your application. And then the next thing would be the timetable builder. So that would be something as you get very close to your particular application cohort, you could check that to kind of make sure that you are choosing a combination of modules that don't clash in terms of their timetable. So I think between those 3 resources, that should be kind of enough information for you to really start to plan and kind of know what's going on in terms of the academic side of things. In terms of housing, so we do have a variety of different on-campus accommodation options. I'll go over those in the next slide. But I would say that housing is limited. It's not guaranteed. So we do encourage students to kind of be open to the idea of living both on or off campus. So I've included resources for that, for those kind of particular options here on this slide. But in terms of if you're staying on campus, and I would say that around 90% of exchange students do end up staying on campus. So if you are applying on time, like meeting the deadlines, paying your fees when you need to, if you kind of follow all of those things, you have a very, very good chance of securing housing. And if you're flexible ultimately with where you stay. So there's 3 different options, and I must admit they all sound really, really similar. So I thought it would be of interest to kind of unpack what all of these different things mean. So the halls of residences would be our smallest residences on campus. They house about 200 to 300 students, and they are kind of scattered throughout campus. So in terms of proximity to your classes, those would probably be the closest kind of in terms of walking or taking a very short bus ride. They have a lot of different events and activities. And so if you're kind of looking for a quiet place to kind of stay and do your studies, I think that the halls could be a little bit loud for those purposes. So kind of keep that in mind as well in terms of the type of experience that you're wanting. But I think they are great in terms of really getting to know campus culture, getting to know locals. So if you're really trying to immerse on campus, the halls of residences are definitely worth putting on your application. The RCs are these integrated academic and residential experiences. They are mostly concentrated at University Town. And because of that academic component, they have very few spots for exchange students. but I just kind of put them on there just in case they appear on your list, and that way you know what the RCs are about. Um, just because they have the academic component, it doesn't mean that you have to take modules. It would just be available to you as a resident of the RC. And then lastly would be the student residences, which are our largest housing complexes. They house a couple of thousand students, so they would be featured there. That would be one of the residences. So just in terms of capacity, you stand a good chance of being housed in one of the residences, just because we have a lot more rooms to go around. And that would be the most independent living of all the different options. So it's a lot of kind of come and go as you please, and not as many activities going on. So those would be the more independent style living. But one thing that NUS does do is we don't have an international block per se. So we don't just put all the exchange students in one block. We actually work with Office of Student Affairs to have a certain percentage of beds in each of the different residence types allocated to exchange students. That way we can kind of disperse everyone, and they can kind of get to know local or full-time students while they're here. So we don't want to kind of house everybody in an international bubble. That's why all three options are available to students. In terms of budget, so I put this slide in there just because Singapore is in the news a lot for being a very expensive city. And I think it's worth kind of qualifying some of those headlines. Often in those studies, they're comparing a basket of goods, and almost always they include car ownership, which if you have some free time, just kind of Google how much it is to buy a car in Singapore. There's a great Fast and the Furious video. They did a premiere here a couple of years ago, and they're telling the cast like how much cars are, and their reactions are kind of priceless. So that can be just a good way to kind of get to know how that survey is skewed, and it makes Singapore sound really expensive. But I would say if you are living on campus or even near campus, if you're eating local food at those kind of hawker centers or food courts, if you're taking public transportation, I think you will find it to be quite an affordable destination. If you're buying cars or private property, then of course it's going to be very expensive. So that is kind of what skews those international kind of rankings of cities. So I found from going from Chapel Hill to Singapore for one semester, I spent about the same, if not a bit less here, just because food was cheaper, transportation was cheaper, all of that kind of stuff. So if you do a bit of research, I think you'll find that Singapore is not as expensive of a place when you think about the everyday expenses that you would actually be encountering when you consider your study abroad choices. So lastly, so this is just kind of matters arising if you are interested in pursuing an exchange to NUS. So I put our application deadlines here. They don't change every year. It's always 15th of April for the fall, and then 1st of October for the spring. Since we're on the equator, we don't really use fall and spring too much. It's semester 1 and semester 2. But that would be the kind of general deadlines. But I would say the first step would be to speak to your study abroad advisor at Georgia Tech, just because you would need to apply internally and kind of work with the advisors there to make sure NUS is a good fit for you as well. So take these deadlines with a pinch of salt, just because you'll need to do things before these deadlines for Georgia Tech before you are nominated and ultimately apply. And then some useful resources. We do have a main page for incoming students, an info sheet and an info guide. So those can be hopefully some good resources for you to just kind of plan further for your exchange. So we couldn't not talk about COVID. I feel like it is the thing that we've been talking about all year. I was actually at Georgia Tech in February, and this pandemic was just in its early days of brewing. We knew it was something big, but it hadn't quite become what it is today. So it's quite remarkable that we're still very much talking about it, 8 months later. But these are just kind of some basic information about what we're doing now. So all of these are really for the fall. As we know, this situation changes so quickly that I think the most important thing on this slide is actually the useful resources and like where you can find the information closer to the time that you plan to arrive in Singapore. So that would be things like what the university is doing, border control measures in terms of if you're allowed to enter Singapore and if there's anything like quarantine that's required. And then of course, insurance coverage, since this is now a known pandemic, and what would be covered and what wouldn't be. But in terms of our fall 2020 provision, so we have actually zoned NUS campus into 3 distinct zones, and that would be based on your major or like where you're actually taking your classes from. So if you are assigned to the Faculty of Science, you would be in Zone A, I believe. Our office is in Zone C, so we're near the business school and the School of Computing. So basically, the internal shuttles have all been rerouted to stick within these zones, and that's hopefully to just kind of cut down on the number of people crossing paths, or if there is a case on campus, it doesn't spread like wildfire on the actual campus. So hopefully it would at least be contained to a zone, or at least the contact tracing would be a little bit easier to facilitate through that zoning. So that's happening right now. Hopefully by the time you arrive in Singapore, things have gotten better and that has been eliminated, because it is a bit of an inconvenience right now with the different zones. In terms of daily temperature, so NUS has rolled out an app, so you're expected to declare your temperature twice a day. You log in and you key it in. If you're going to class in the morning, or just basically your first time on campus, you are expected to key in your temperature before arriving on campus, just to kind of make sure that you don't have any symptoms before physically being on campus. Right now, most classes are online. Campus is very, very quiet, so I think we're more than halfway through with the semester, and it kind of doesn't feel like it started just because so many students are studying online. But any class that's over 50, that would automatically be online. Other classes that have fewer than 50 students have actually gone online as well. Basically right now, it's like if it's a studio or a lab class, those are the things that are being prioritized for in-person instruction. Access to health services and swabbing. So the government has announced that anyone above the age of 13 who displays any symptom of an acute respiratory condition will be swab tested. So it's kind of expected, and access to testing is widely available. So even UHC on campus, you would be expected to call before you arrive. And then I was just there last week for something not COVID related, and there's different zones. So you can already tell that they have a well thought out plan for how to get the COVID and non-COVID people to not cross paths. In terms of kind of some national wide initiatives, we do have a check-in, check-out system. So you're expected to scan a QR code as you enter buildings, restaurants, anything like that. So you check in and you check out, and that's really to help facilitate contact tracing. And it's actually a good peace of mind, because as you do that, you'll get a notification that says, like, in the last 14 days, you haven't been anywhere that's had a known case. So I feel like there's a lot of like reassurance, as well as they kind of keep track with that encrypted data of like where people are going. So it's anonymous, but like it's pegged to your phone, and so they would be able to access you should you be in contact with a known case. And then lastly would be the mandatory mask wearing. So all people need to wear masks outside their place of residence. So it's just automatic. As soon as you walk out of your place of residence, you're expected to have a mask on at all times, unless you're eating. And then it wouldn't be very pleasant to end on such a topic like COVID. So we did want to kind of round things up with, over the course of the last 20 plus years, we've actually welcomed over 20,000 exchange students. So it is quite a robust program with quite a number of alumni. So we do encourage you to be part of the NUS community. And then last thing would be this video. So this is a video from an exchange student who was here recently. And he kind of captures what a day in the life of an exchange at NUS is like. So if you're interested in just kind of a student perspective, that is a great resource as well, and quite recent. I think a few semesters ago he made that video. And that's kind of all for the actual meat of the presentation. If you have any questions, feel free to use the microphone or the chat feature, and I can stick around for a little while. Just make sure I have it where I can see the chat.